Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's a great pleasure to be back here. I heard this summit's been around for a while. This is kind of a nice thing. Mastercard Global Inclusive Growth Summit. I wonder who thought of it. It's a great panel we have here, and what a time to get together. Not just because we have the IMF World Bank meetings going on this week, but there's probably been no more dynamic time in development policy than we're seeing right now. Let me ask the one American on the panel, Jay, who spends a lot of time trying to decipher what's going on across the government. How would you assess this administration's approach to development? What's new and different about it? I thought it would be an easy question. And by the way, we know...
I thought we were friends.
Yeah. Jay and I go way back. We saw, just as we were walking in, that I gather the Millennium Challenge Corporation has been shut down by Doge this afternoon. So yet another step in restructuring U.S. development policy. Looking on the positive side, Jay, what do you see as the potential way forward for U.S. development policy?
Wow, okay. So we'll start easy. First, I would say that if you look at the early days of the administration, there is a reorientation toward not just an America first, but a national security-oriented thought process of which countries, which projects are really in the U.S. interest, and framing development from the perspective of national security priorities. So let's take what would be of interest in Africa, critical minerals, transport from rare earth minerals to a port. If you looked at the energy space, it would be energy security as opposed to energy transition, and you might be more apt to look at LNG. You might be looking more at a country that had a strategic resource or strategic position vis-a-vis China and its interest. And so that framework, that prism, is more likely to frame whether there's a desire to either put capital or resources or risk against an opportunity. It certainly wouldn't be traditional development, and that's where I think when we look at whether it's the future of trade, of development banks, of climate policy, others, either in the G7, in the OECD, others will have to step in to that gap.
You know, it strikes me that with the restructuring of AID and what we've just learned about MCC, the role of the private sector is perhaps more important than ever. Odile, that was really the EBRD's founding, was to mobilize the private sector for the restructuring and the development of Eastern Europe after the fall of the wall. Its mandate has expanded beyond that. So you've got great experience in seeing how the MDBs can leverage the expertise and the capital of the private sector. What do you see as the biggest opportunities now going forward? And as the U.S. pulls back, how do you see Europeans stepping up into this space?
So, no, indeed, I think you're very right saying the role of the private sector will become even more important. It was already, I mean, before this decision on USAID and so forth, very important in terms of, you know, reaching the gap to reach the objective of the SDGs, finance the green transition and so forth. I think now it's even more important, and we see, for example, the World Bank putting at the core of its strategy the private sector development. There are opportunities, of course, because I think that there is a lot of capital that can be invested and growth, economic growth, and potential growth in emerging markets is there. So I think that's a source of dynamism and investment opportunities. It needs some work, and that's where the MDBs have a very important role to play, I think, to develop projects, and this is a discussion we are often having in how best the interaction between public and private can be operated. And I would say, I mean, I think a lot of work that needs to be done by MDBs, and that's our experience, in at the country level to prepare the projects, to develop the policies and to help the countries design the policies that will be conducive to private sector investment, rule of law, transparency, investment protection, and so forth. So that's a very important component. And then provide some financing ourselves, use our balance sheet to provide some financing ourselves, to put our money where our mouth is and create some trust in the investment. And then that helps bringing in private investors. What we are working on is traditionally we were doing sort of B loans, co-financing with private sector. I think that because of the scale, and we need really to scale up, and it cannot be only we invest and we have a co-investment with the private sector and so forth. We need to find ways to bring in more proactively private sector, develop new financial instruments. For example, in EBRD, we've developed very actively insurers financing with sort of unfunded guarantee where they share the risk with us and provide them some source of revenues and return, and it helps us leveraging our balance sheet at a higher level. We are also, I think us, IFC has been also very proactive in doing that, developing mobilization through synthetic securitization and so forth. So all these kind of new financial instruments will be important, and I think at all levels we need to see how we can leverage the private sector at the country level, but also on our own balance sheet.
President Kanda, you have a front row seat in Asia, looking at what China is doing in the region, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, along with, of course, the Asian Development Bank. As you look at the various models of mobilizing the private sector across Asia, what are you most proud of that the ADB has been doing? And what do you think is the real opportunity for the ADB going forward?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, this is a really difficult time, full of uncertainty and geopolitical risks and trade conflicts. But I believe this is a good opportunity. This risk can be turned to the greater incentive to continue reform for the open up the economy or the more domestic demand and the regional cooperation and integration. There are many things, and thank you very much for pointing out the private sector development, because I put PSD, private sector development, as a first priority of the Asian Development Bank. Indeed, we commit the lending to the private sector development will quadruple 4 times to 13 billion annual commitment in 2030. And this is very much important given the enormous amount of financial resources for the poverty reduction or the climate action and so on, and also the limitation of the public finances. We definitely needed to mobilize more private capital, but even more importantly, I want to introduce the private sector, solve the competition or the dynamism to the economy, which is the engine of the job creation and innovation also. And not only for the magnitude, it's very much important for the innovation in financial instruments. I appreciate the Odile's leadership. We are also pioneering the blending finance or the sustainability-linked bonds, as well as the more aggressive equity investment for the de-risking. And finally, for the institution, I believe the further integration of public-private, the sovereign operation and non-sovereign operation are even more important, because sometimes, for instance, the public sector problem, the obstacle for the further private sector development. So if we find something, the integrated multidisciplinary team will address, including, among others, the public sector management reform, like the deregulation or even privatization, or the PPP approaches. And finally, the one example of a PPP transaction services, our office headquarters is in Manila, and we supported the transaction for the Manila International Airport PPP, which through the reform and the human capital development and so on, benefiting the 60 million annual passengers. So enormous potential for us to do. Thank you.
Jay, you've been around in this area for a while. You've seen the ebbs and flows of capital to emerging markets and developing countries. When people talk about scaling up, whether it's for climate finance, development finance, energy transition, what do you think the private sector is really waiting for? What do they need? Is it blended finance vehicles, insurance, risk mitigation, or is there a misperception of risk, or do you think the private sector is likely to step in, working with the MDBs to play a much greater role in this going forward?
So I've been an advocate for major reform and major change in the thought process in private capital mobilization for a very long time, none of which we've really seen at the scale and speed that we need. I think first is that the banks, pension funds, insurance companies have fiduciary responsibilities and regulatory frameworks around which there are constraints to invest in development and climate in the emerging markets, and particularly in the weaker credit zip code, the poorer countries. And so you have to mitigate that. You have to have risk mitigation tools, and we've yet to really take the next step in terms of mitigating the risk of the private sector to crowd them in. And if you look at this new environment in and around Trump, I think it's more important than ever, because what is happening and will happen over time is the starvation for funds in the IDA countries, the poorest countries, not just the USAID monies, which will no longer go, but then what's happening politically, which Odile knows so well, in Europe, both from the right, the defense spending budget, the demands on European fiscal spend means that when I asked the Europeans here over the last couple of days, can they step in and fill that void, there's great concern that they just can't. And so what does that mean for private capital mobilization? It means that if we don't take the MDBs and have them focus more on the poorest countries where the private sector can't go, and just really go down into IDA space, the poorest countries, and they don't put their capital to mobilize the private sector, then you'll have a crisis in both zones. So you've now basically going to have to take that middle tier, and you're going to have to mobilize. We were already short of funds, but you're just going to have to mobilize much more aggressively, much faster in the middle income countries, so that you can then worry about the down market that will be starving for the ODA and potentially what will be a resistance to put more capital into the development banks. I'm very concerned that there is a China issue in all this, which is China is stepping into the noise that's been created now in a very significant way. The last 2 days, all I've heard, Michael, is just about China's looking at this as a major opportunity, and it will step in. And so if China does that, countries will be making a choice between these two worlds. That's one. Two, the fundamental private sector investment in many of these countries coming out of the United States will be forced to look at this prism and be handicapped by it. And finally, if there isn't actually support from the Trump administration for the MDBs, there will be a capitalization challenge as to whether they're diluted and who steps into that. And if fundamentally the Chinese step into that, then things will get much more complicated.
Odile, we have a little over a minute left, so I'm going to give you a very easy question, which is, how do we reconstruct Ukraine? And will the EBRD be able to step up?
We are already reconstructing.
I know. You're very active there.
Just one point I want to add on the financing of developing countries. There is one dimension that we often overlook, which is the mobilization of financing from the countries themselves.
Yes.
And there is a lot of savings in these countries, but the savings are not invested in the country themselves because of the lack of financial vehicles, financial instruments, and so forth. So one role of the MDB is also to mobilize local savings to support, and we work a lot on that to get local currency and be able ourselves to finance in local currency. But I think this will be a more and more important dimension as a contribution for investment. For Ukraine, I think that we need to invest, we need to support them, and we need to continue to support them. And then this is what EBRD is doing massively to keep the infrastructure going. Energy challenges are huge. If you don't have energy, an economy cannot function. So keeping the energy functioning, supporting them in all this energy infrastructure, access to gas and so forth is very important. And continuing to support the private sector, which remains. It's quite amazing to see that the country in war, after a big shock, has been in positive growth in the last 2 years and this year again. So there is some potential. We need to remain there and supportive and be ready to step up when peace is there.
Well, all I know is in the context of the U.S. perhaps retreating in some of our traditional aid approaches, the three of you are more important than ever. So thank you for all that you do, and thank you for joining us here today.